They thought he was just a loudmouth teenager, until he took over the case and tore the prosecution apart. Bam! The gavel slams down, sending a sharp crack echoing through the courtroom. The air is thick, partly with tension, partly with the mix of expensive colognes and stale coffee. All eyes are on the defense table, but not for the right reasons. At the center of it all sits Tanisha Ellis, a 26-year-old woman with tired eyes and a clenched jaw, her fingers gripping the armrest of her chair so tightly her knuckles turn white. She's here, in this suffocating room of judgment, fighting a charge she never deserved. Shoplifting. Ridiculous. Her lawyer, a public defender who looks like he'd rather be anywhere else, adjusts his tie for the third time in 2 minutes. He's sweating. He's losing. And Jaylen Ellis knows it. 19 years old. Tall, slim, with deep brown skin and shoulders that seem too heavy for his age. He sits in the second row, arms crossed, a blank expression masking the storm brewing inside. He wasn't supposed to speak. He came to support his sister, to let the system do what it claims it does, deliver justice. But the moment the prosecutor smirks, Jaylen knows. This isn't about justice. This is a performance, and Tanisha is the scapegoat. The store security footage was grainy, the evidence flimsy at best, and yet the prosecutor, Michael Thornton, parades around like he has an airtight case. The jury barely looks at Tanisha. The judge, Judge Reynolds, an older man with sharp features and tired eyes, barely conceals his boredom. Then the public defender stumbles, literally. He fumbles his papers, shuffles through them with the urgency of a man drowning in his own incompetence. Jaylen leans forward, hands gripping his knees. The prosecutor knows this case shouldn't hold, but he's confident. Why? Because no one in this room expects Tanisha to win. Because she doesn't look like someone who gets the benefit of the doubt. And then, it happens. The prosecutor twists the facts, rearranges the truth like a magician performing sleight of hand. He references a past misdemeanor, a traffic violation, not theft, not fraud, a ticket. Yet, he speaks as if it proves something bigger. The public defender says nothing. Jaylen's chest tightens. He sees where this is going. They're going to railroad his sister. Before he even realizes what he's doing, he speaks. Objection. Silence. The prosecutor pauses mid-sentence. Judge Reynolds turns his head so slowly it's almost comical. The entire courtroom shifts, focusing on the kid in the hoodie who just spoke out of turn. "Excuse me?" the judge asks, his voice laced with amusement. Jaylen doesn't back down. His heart is pounding, but his voice, steady. "That statement is prejudicial and irrelevant to the case. My sister's driving history has nothing to do with what's being alleged here." A beat of silence. Then, laughter. Not just from the prosecutor, from the jury, from the spectators, even from the judge himself. Judge Reynolds leans forward, eyes twinkling with condescension. "Son, this is a court of law, not a classroom. You don't get to play lawyer here." The chuckles ripple through the room. The prosecutor shakes his head, already turning back to the jury, ready to continue the show. But Jaylen doesn't sit down. Instead, he reaches into his pocket. The judge is about to tell security to remove him when Jaylen pulls out something small, something that shuts everyone up instantly. A bar ID. The silence is deafening. The prosecutor's smirk fades. The judge leans back ever so slightly. Jaylen holds it up, his voice even calmer than before. "Actually, Your Honor, I'm a licensed attorney in this state." The entire courtroom stops breathing. But what happens next? It only gets worse for them. The silence in the courtroom stretches too long, like the world itself has stopped turning. The judge blinks once, twice. His lips part, but no sound comes out. The prosecutor's smirk has completely vanished. The jury stares, some shifting in their seats. A few steal glances at the laminated bar ID in Jaylen's hand, as if they need a second to process what they're seeing. This kid, this 19-year-old in sneakers and a hoodie, just flipped the entire courtroom on its head. The first person to break the silence is, surprisingly, the public defender. He clears his throat and slowly steps aside, his eyes darting between Jaylen and the judge, as if waiting for someone to confirm this isn't a prank. Jaylen doesn't move. He stands there, shoulders squared, his fingers gripping the ID like a weapon. Because in this room? It is. Finally, Judge Reynolds regains his voice. You are an attorney. His voice is quieter now, measured, not mocking, not yet. Jaylen nods, slipping the ID back into his pocket. Yes, Your Honor. I graduated early, passed the bar last year. The judge exhales sharply through his nose, glancing at the court clerk, then at the prosecutor, then at the public defender who looks more than happy to fade into the background. And what exactly are you doing here today, Mr. Ellis? Jaylen's jaw tightens, but his voice remains calm, controlled. I came to support my sister. He glances at Tanisha, still sitting at the defense table, her hands clasped together in shock. Then he turns back to the judge. But given how this case is being handled, I'd like to formally take over her defense. A ripple of whispers surges through the gallery. Even the jury, who's been largely passive up until now, seems more alert. But the prosecutor isn't laughing anymore. Michael Thornton, a man used to having complete control of his courtroom, folds his arms and shakes his head. This is ridiculous, he mutters, looking at the judge. Your Honor, I don't know what kind of stunt this is, but… Jaylen cuts him off. A stunt? He lets out a dry, humorless chuckle. You mean like using my sister's driving record to sway a jury on a shoplifting charge? The room shifts. Even Judge Reynolds leans forward slightly, watching. The prosecutor's face reddens, but he forces out a dismissive scoff. Oh, come on. This kid is barely old enough to buy a drink. You expect me to believe he's actually passed the bar? Jaylen shrugs, pulling out his phone. A few taps, and then he holds it up for everyone to see. His name, his credentials, his bar registration. It's real. He's real. Judge Reynolds rubs his temple, his patience thinning. But now, instead of seeing Jaylen as a joke, he sees a problem. A young black attorney stepping into his courtroom, uninvited, unshaken. This is highly unorthodox, the judge says slowly, weighing his words. But legal. The prosecutor huffs. His jaw works like he's grinding his teeth. Fine, he says, gritting the word out. If he wants to embarrass himself, let's proceed. Jaylen finally steps forward, sliding into the seat beside his sister. Tanisha is still staring at him, eyes wide, half in disbelief, half in awe. He leans in, voice low. You good? She nods slowly. I don't know how you're pulling this off, but… We've got this, he says, offering her a small, reassuring nod. Then he straightens, turning his full attention to the case. Because now it's war. And the first thing he does, he asks the one question that changes everything. Jaylen leans forward, elbows on the defense table, fingers interlocked. His expression is unreadable, but his mind, it's already 10 steps ahead. Mr. Thornton, he says smoothly, locking eyes with the prosecutor. Let's start with the basics. Can you remind the court of the exact time the alleged shoplifting took place? The prosecutor stiffens slightly, caught off guard by how quickly Jaylen is taking control. He clears his throat and checks his notes, like he doesn't already know. According to the store security footage, 3:42 p.m., he says. Jaylen nods. Right. And where exactly was my client when security approached her? Thornton raises a brow. She was near the store exit. Jaylen tilts his head slightly, feigning curiosity. Not outside the store. Not beyond the theft detection gates. Thornton pauses, because the way Jaylen phrases it is dangerous. No, he admits reluctantly. She hadn't left the premises yet. Jaylen doesn't even blink. So, to be clear, my client never actually exited the store with unpaid merchandise. Thornton shifts. She was heading toward the exit. Jaylen gives a knowing smile, just enough for the jury to notice. Right. Heading toward. But hadn't left. Yet security detained her anyway. He turns, addressing the jury now. Does that sound like someone who was caught stealing? Or someone who was still inside the store, possibly on her way to purchase the items in question? A small ripple of whispers spreads across the jury box. The prosecutor knows this is a bad look. He quickly moves to regain control. Your Honor, intent to steal does not require exiting the premises. But it does require intent, Mr. Thornton. Jaylen cuts in smoothly. And so far, all we have is assumption. Thornton clenches his jaw. We have video footage. Jaylen nods like he's considering this. Then, without missing a beat, Great. Let's talk about that. He turns toward the court clerk. Your Honor, I'd like to have the footage played again for the jury. Judge Reynolds hesitates. He knows where this is going, but he also knows there's no legal reason to deny the request. Finally, he gestures to the clerk. Proceed. The screen flickers, and grainy black and white footage fills the courtroom. The jury leans forward. Everyone watches as Tanisha browses the shelves, picks up a pair of earrings, a scarf, and a clutch bag. She walks toward the register, where a line has formed. Then something interesting happens. She stops, checks her phone, then turns slightly, as if looking for something. Security moves in before she even makes it to the register. Jaylen leans back in his chair, letting the silence stretch. Ladies and gentlemen, he finally says, addressing the jury, where in that footage do you see my client stealing? No one answers, because there's nothing to answer. The prosecutor adjusts his tie, a flicker of frustration in his movements. Security had reason to believe she was attempting to leave without paying. Jaylen lifts a hand. Ah, see, that's the thing. They believed. They assumed. But belief isn't evidence. Assumption isn't proof. He lets his words settle. Then, with a deliberate pause, he adds, unless, of course, there was some other reason they decided she was a thief. The implication hangs in the air. Thornton's face tightens. Judge Reynolds shifts in his chair. Jaylen lets it sit just long enough. Then he stands. I'd like to call the store's security manager to the stand. And that's when the case really starts falling apart. The store's head of security, Richard Dawson, takes the stand. Late 50s, broad shoulders, the kind of guy who's been in the business too long to second-guess himself. But Jaylen? He's about to make him do exactly that. Jaylen approaches casually, hands in his pockets. Mr. Dawson, how long have you worked in retail security? Dawson clears his throat. 23 years. Jaylen nods. So you've dealt with shoplifting cases before? Dawson scoffs. Hundreds. Right. And your store has theft prevention policies in place, correct? Of course. Jaylen tilts his head slightly. And what are those policies regarding stopping a customer? Do you require visual confirmation of theft before detaining someone? Dawson hesitates. Well, yes, he admits. Typically, an associate or loss prevention officer needs to see someone take merchandise and make no attempt to pay before intervention. Jaylen raises a brow. But in my sister's case, security stepped in before she even reached the register. Dawson's mouth presses into a firm line. It was based on her behavior. Jaylen nods. Her behavior. Can you clarify what exactly was suspicious? Dawson shifts slightly in his seat. She was looking around a lot, checking her phone. Jaylen lets out a soft breath as if he's been waiting for this. Looking around, checking her phone. He lets the words hang. Then, tell me, Mr. Dawson, If she were a young, well-dressed white woman doing the exact same thing, would you have stopped her? The tension in the room snaps tight. A murmur rises in the gallery. Dawson's face reddens. I don't make decisions based on race. Jaylen steps closer, his voice calm but razor-sharp. Really? Because it sure seems like that's the only suspicious behavior you had. My sister didn't conceal merchandise. She didn't exit the store. She was browsing, like any other customer. Dawson shifts, adjusting his jacket. Jaylen's voice turns just a notch colder. But you stopped her. You accused her. You called the police before she even had the chance to prove you wrong. Dawson swallows. We have discretion. Jaylen presses forward. So your discretion is based on gut feelings, not facts. Silence. The jury is watching. So is the judge. So is the entire room. Jaylen steps back, his job already done. No further questions. Dawson looks at the judge, but there's no saving this. The damage is done. And Jaylen is just getting started. Because next, he turns his attention back to the prosecution, and he's about to end them. Jaylen returns to the defense table, calm, composed, but ready to strike. The courtroom is still buzzing from his exchange with the security manager, but he barely notices. He keeps his focus on Michael Thornton, the prosecutor. And Thornton knows he's losing. The jury isn't looking at him the same way anymore. They're thinking now. Processing. Doubting. Judge Reynolds leans forward slightly. Mr. Thornton, do you wish to redirect? Thornton clears his throat. He needs to recover, fast. Yes, Your Honor. He straightens his tie, turns toward the jury, and tries to salvage what's left. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not get distracted here. Yes, security made the call, but that doesn't change the fact that Ms. Ellis was seen handling the merchandise and moving toward the exit without making a purchase. Jaylen leans back, arms crossed. He already sees the cracks in the argument. Thornton continues, trying to sound confident. The prosecution maintains that the intent was clear. She was leaving with unpaid items in her possession. Jaylen waits a second longer than necessary. Then he stands, slow and deliberate, letting the moment settle. Mr. Thornton, he says, stepping toward the prosecution's table. Do you know what assumption does in a court of law? Thornton bristles. Objection. Argumentative. Judge Reynolds exhales through his nose. Sustained. Move to a question, Mr. Ellis. Jaylen doesn't even blink. My apologies, Your Honor. He turns back to Thornton. Let me rephrase. Can you point to any moment in the surveillance footage where my client actively concealed merchandise? Thornton clenches his jaw. No. But... Jaylen lifts a hand. Did security find stolen items on her when they stopped her? Thornton hesitates. They found unpaid merchandise in her hands. Jaylen's eyes narrow slightly. Right. In her hands. Not in a bag. Not under her clothing. In her hands. In plain view. Like someone still shopping. Thornton shifts. It's about intent. Jaylen takes another step closer. Then let's talk intent, Mr. Thornton. His voice stays level, even, almost conversational. Since you claim to know my client's intent better than she does, tell me, what did she say when security approached her? Thornton hesitates. Jaylen pushes forward. She told them she was still shopping, didn't she? Thornton looks down at his notes. Jaylen's voice sharpens. Didn't she? Thornton sighs, jaw tightening. Yes. Jaylen turns to the jury, spreading his arms. So let's summarize. We have a woman shopping, holding items, never leaving the store, never hiding anything, who tells security she was still browsing. He lets it sink in. Then he turns back to Thornton. And you're calling that shoplifting? Thornton doesn't answer, because he can't. The courtroom is dead silent. Jaylen doesn't let up. Now let's talk about fairness. He steps back, pacing slightly, voice steady. How many times have you, or someone you know, walked around a store, held onto an item, and kept browsing? He looks at the jury. Maybe you weren't sure if you wanted to buy it yet. Maybe you were waiting for a friend to finish shopping. Maybe you got a text and got distracted for a second. He stops, lets them feel it. How many times has that happened? The jurors exchange looks. Because now it's personal. Jaylen zeroes in. But how many times has security grabbed you, pulled you aside, called the police before you even had a chance to check out? A few of the jurors shift. Jaylen turns back to Thornton. So tell me, Mr. Thornton, if my client looked different, would we even be here today? Thornton's lips press into a thin line. Jaylen lets the moment breathe. Then, finally, no further questions. And just like that, the case collapses. Judge Reynolds rubs his temple, exhaling slowly. The weight of the moment settles over the entire courtroom. Counselors, approach. Jaylen doesn't move immediately. He exchanges a quick glance with Tanisha. She's holding her breath. Then he steps toward the judge's bench. Thornton does the same, looking defeated. Judge Reynolds rests his chin on his hands, studying them both. This case, he mutters, voice low enough that the jury can't hear, shouldn't have made it this far. He glances at Thornton. The state would be wise to reconsider its stance. Thornton clenches his jaw. For a second, Jaylen almost feels bad for him. Almost. Then the judge leans back and says the words that change everything. The charges against Ms. Ellis are dismissed. A gasp ripples through the courtroom. Thornton looks like he just swallowed glass, but he nods stiffly. Understood, Your Honor. Jaylen barely reacts. Just a slow nod, like he already knew this was coming. He turns to Tanisha. She's frozen in place. Then finally she exhales. A small, almost disbelieving laugh escapes her. Did that just happen? She whispers. Jaylen smirks. Yeah, it did. But before they can even celebrate, something else happens. The judge isn't done. Because now, he's looking at the store's security manager. And what happens next, no one expects. Judge Reynolds straightens in his chair, fixing his gaze on the store's security manager, Richard Dawson. This court may not be in the business of issuing lectures, he says, voice steady, deliberate. But I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge what just happened here today. Dawson shifts uncomfortably. The entire courtroom is watching. The facts were clear, the judge continues. There was no theft, no evidence of intent, just a snap judgment, one that could have changed this young woman's life forever. A beat of silence. The weight of those words settles over the room. I suggest your store re-examine its loss prevention policies. Closely. Dawson nods stiffly, face red. Judge Reynolds exhales and bangs the gavel. Case dismissed. Jaylen finally lets himself breathe. Tanisha grabs his hand, squeezing it tight. You really did that, she whispers. He grins. They never saw it coming. As they step outside, a thought lingers. How many others never get this moment? How many walk into courtrooms without a Jaylen to fight for them? And maybe, just maybe, it's time for that to change. Because justice shouldn't depend on who's in your corner. Have you or someone you know ever faced an unfair situation like this? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it. And if you believe in holding people accountable, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories that need to be told.